Before we get started, I want to encourage you to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so that you don't miss any of the content that is released by Go Collect. And if you're interested, head over to Regie Collects here on YouTube. Regie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and the host of the Go Collect weekly speculation recap video. I want to welcome you to another episode. I think we are on week 4 by this point, and I am having a lot of fun recapping these blog posts for you every single week. For those that may be watching this video for the first time, in this video, I basically recap 5 to 6 blog posts that have been submitted by bloggers all across the US into Go Collect. And one of the things that I always like to do is to recommend that you take the time to actually read these blog posts in their entirety, because what I'll be doing is only touching on a couple of points from the various posts. And there may be some details that are going to be important to you, so you want to take the time to read them, and the link to all the blog posts are down in the description. So this very first article I think is a cool one, and I think it's cool because it is a little different from some of the things that we've talked about over the last several weeks. In this article, the blogger actually takes a look at some early work that was done by some really fantastic artists for Marvel. And these are believed to be the very first works that some of these creators actually did at Marvel. Now, what makes it tricky is that some of these artists were actually around when Marvel wasn't Marvel. They were around when Marvel was known as Timely or as Atlas Comics. And so it's a little tricky, but I think it's still a really cool article. And I think Ryan who is the blogger, had to do a lot of research in order to put this one together. The article is entitled Collecting the First Works of Marvel's Great Artists. And Ryan starts off on a really high note, talking about none other than Jack King Kirby. And in this blog, he actually highlights that Strange Worlds #1 is considered to be Jack Kirby's first work on behalf of Marvel. He highlights the fact that there are only about 64 copies of this particular book on the CGC census. He goes on to say that all sales at all grades of this book have been just under $1,000, which is not a bad price to pay for something that is associated with the King Kirby, that is. The next creator that Ryan highlights in his article is one of my favorite, and he's one of my favorites because he is associated with one of my favorite characters, that being Spider-Man, and we are talking about none other than Steve Ditko. And his first work is considered to be Journey into Mystery #33. And this was something that was actually published in November of 1956 by a young Steven Ditko. Ryan highlights in his blog post that there are few issues of this book on the census, and he highlights that one recently sold at a 4.0 for just north of $200. The next creator highlighted by Ryan is John Buscema, and in this article he highlights that his earliest work is considered to be Strange Tales #150, and in 1966 a young John Buscema actually penciled a fantastic story featuring Nick Fury in this particular issue. Ryan highlights that there are around 200 CGC copies available, and he highlights that the prices for this particular book are actually reasonable. In January of this year, a 9.2 copy sold for under $200, while a 9.4 actually sold for only $252. And again, I want to encourage you to go read this blog post in its entirety, because Ryan goes on to talk about John Romita Sr. and Todd McFarlane and some other creators. So check out the link in the description for all the details. So in previous weeks, bloggers have asked some provocative questions as to whether speculators should crack slabs and regrade books and whether now is the time to invest in one character or another. This blogger takes a slightly different approach and they don't ask a question. They actually make a declarative statement that now is the time to invest in the Inhumans. This is actually a really solid blog post by a blogger by the name of Robert, and he goes into some detail around why now is the time to actually invest in the Inhumans, and he highlights in this blog post that the Inhumans actually have a role to play in the MCU, and he actually makes a case for how the Inhumans could be integrated into one of the Disney Plus streaming programs. And so if you are an Inhumans fan, if you're interested in figuring out, how this blogger thinks that the Inhumans fit in, I definitely want to encourage you to check out this blog post in its entirety because he makes a pretty solid case that you should take a look at. Now, with that said, he also highlights a couple of cool books that you might want to consider picking up that are associated with the Inhumans. And so in this article, the blogger takes a look at one of the more obvious, right? That being Fantastic Four number 36, which is the first appearance of Medusa. It is personally a cover that is most familiar to me when I think about the Inhumans, but he goes on to talk about Fantastic Four number 45, the first appearance of the Inhumans themselves, Fantastic Four 46, the first appearance of King Black Bolt, and he also talks about Fantastic Four number 37, the first appearance of Maximus, as well as Captain Marvel number 14, the first appearance of Miss Marvel, Miss Khan. So if you are interested again in the Inhumans, you might want to take a look at these books, and you certainly want to take a look at this blog post. This next article is actually focused a little bit on the MCU, which I think is really cool. And in this article written by Robert, he basically makes the case for why it is time for Mr. Sinister to have his moment in the sun. Robert talks about how he thinks that the MCU isn't going to look at the obvious characters of Apocalypse and Magneto, but is instead going to turn its attention to a character that fans, that we have been clamoring to see on the big screen. None other than Mr. Sinister, the person that is obsessed with mutants. And so if Robert is correct, there is certainly one book that you want to make sure that you pick up. And that book is Uncanny X-Men number 221. That is the first appearance of Mr. Sinister that was released in September of 1987. Now, what's great about this particular book, that being Uncanny X-Men number 221, is that you can actually pick this book up for not a whole lot of money. In fact, a 9.8 will range somewhere between $239 and $300, which isn't too bad for a really nice copy of a really cool book associated with the X-Men. So if you believe in Mr. Sinister or the X-Men, you might want to take a look at this book. There is a lot of speculation right now about the She-Hulk TV show on the Disney Plus streaming service. A lot of speculation right now about the fact that the Red Hulk could actually make an appearance in that streaming service and then ultimately make his way into an MCU movie. And if you believe the hype, if you believe the rumor, now might be the time for you to pick up one of these books associated with the Red Hulk. And in this blog post entitled Red Hulk and the MCU, Time to Buy 2008's Hulk number 1, the blogger actually highlights a couple of books that you might want to consider picking up. And he says that there are really only 2 issues that should be on your list when it comes to the Red Hulk, that being Red Hulk number 1. And so he actually highlights that this issue is red hot and grades are on the move. He points out that a 9.8 of this book actually sold for about $204 when it averaged about $98 in 2018. He goes on to talk about how you might want to take a look at a couple of variants of Hulk #1, that being the Hero Initiative Atomic Comics variant. He highlights that last year, a 9.8 set a record with a sale of $425. And this year already, one has sold for $375. The other book, the other variant of Hulk #1 from 2008 that you might want to take a look at is one by Ed McGuinness, and it's the Ed McGuinness Retailer variant. He highlights that while a 9.8 has not traded hands in 2020, the last one that was sold actually set a record in 2019 at $500. He goes on to talk about some of the second prints that you might also want to take a look at. But the other book that he really highlights in addition to Hulk #1 is Hulk #2, also from 2008. He highlights here that this is a really cool book in that it is a reflection of the Red Hulk in Iron Man's broken helmet. And this is actually a book that I own along with the Ed McGuinness variant. So again, another blog post that resonates with me. He highlights here that the standard cover of this book at a 9.8, that being Hulk #2, actually sold for $61 last year. So again, if you believe that the Red Hulk could appear in the Disney streaming service, you might want to take a look at these books. November 29th, 2020. It's an important day. I would encourage you to write it down. Mark it on your calendars. It's an important day. If you were a fan of any of the Marvel shows that were on Netflix, on the 29th of November 2020 is the date in which the contract that those actors signed expires. They had an agreement that prevented them from appearing as those characters anywhere for 2 years. And on the 29th of November, the contract expires. And there is a belief that these actors could reprise their roles somewhere in the MCU, potentially on the big screen, potentially on the Disney streaming service. And this blogger has written an article, and it's entitled, "What's the Deal with Daredevil?" He believes that Daredevil is going to appear at some point in the near future, potentially in a Spider-Man thing or potentially on a streaming service or something like that. He makes the argument because of the popularity of the Netflix series featuring Daredevil. There were a lot of people that were comic fans that watched it. There were a lot of people that were not comic fans that watched it. And the blogger believes that Daredevil now has some name recognition that Marvel wants to capitalize on. And he doesn't make any promises about the fact that this is going to happen, but it kind of makes sense if you think about it. If you watch that show, you know how good it was. So if you believe that there is a possibility that Daredevil could appear at some point in the near term, or even a year from now or 2 years from now, you might want to take a look at a couple of important Daredevil books. And the blogger points out a couple of really cool comics. Again, one of them is certainly an obvious one, that being Daredevil #1. It's a fantastic comic that I own, that I absolutely enjoy. Another book that he highlights is Amazing Spider-Man #50, a classic cover. And then the very last one that he highlights is Amazing Spider-Man #16, which is the first ever team up between Daredevil and Spider-Man. A less obvious choice, but maybe a good one because Daredevil could appear potentially in a Spider-Man movie. You never know. So if you are a fan of Daredevil or Netflix and those programs that they had there, you might want to think about taking a look at some of these books and a couple that weren't mentioned associated with those TV shows. In this final blog post, the blogger makes, I think, a really compelling argument for why now might be the time to look at books associated with Kitty Pryde. And this blog post is entitled, Kitty Pryde is the MCU's next star. They highlight in this article that the future of the MCU is female. They speak about the fact that Marvel Studios has put a focus on female characters, and they highlight that last year Captain Marvel dominated the box office, grossing over $1 billion worldwide, and is in fact the first time a female-led superhero movie has actually done this. And they highlight, with the attention being on female characters and the female audience, that the forthcoming X-Men reboot could be led by a woman, and who better than Kitty Pryde? And there are a lot of people that are a huge fan of Kitty Pryde. And if you are reading any of the things related to the X-Men now, like Marauders, you know that it's no longer Kitty Pryde. It is Kate Pryde, and she is a force. If you aren't reading the Marauders right now, I encourage you to read it. I was never really a big fan of Kitty Pryde until this recent Marauder series, and now I just cannot look away, to be honest. And the blogger points out that Uncanny X-Men number 129 is a little bit of a beast of a book to pick up. This is the first appearance of Kitty Pryde, but it's also the first look at a couple of other characters, which makes this book a little pricey. They highlight that in February of this year, a 9.8 copy actually sold for $1,300, but they point out that lower grade books, like a 7.5, can actually be picked up for about $95, and a 9.6 even can be picked up for about $326. So if you believe in Kate Pryde, Kitty Pryde, the future of what may happen with the X-Men franchise, this might not be a bad way to go. I mean, Kitty Pryde is actually a pretty popular character historically, and definitely is getting a lot of attention right now. So you might want to take a look at Uncanny X-Men 129. So there you have it. We have reached the end of another recap video. I hope that you enjoyed it. I want to encourage you to take the time to leave a comment behind, give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you next Wednesday for next week's recap.